How's it going, everybody? So now we're going to talk about the exciting topic of compliance. Yes, everybody's favorite. So, just a little bit of background on Netki and who we are. Myself and my co-founder spent a little bit more than 20 years doing startups. Along the way, been involved in helping take 4 companies public. Probably the best known of those is Net0, the free ISP. We've been working in the blockchain space for actually almost 5 years now, and we work pretty broadly across the space with everything from a couple of founders working on a token sale through some large exchanges. So important, pay attention to this information. Everything I'm giving you here is background. One of the things that's very important about compliance, particularly in the United States, is that compliance policies and procedures always have to be custom developed based on your specific use cases. So one of your first steps in any of these processes is not going to be to come to me as a service provider, but to go to your compliance counsel to help craft the policies to let you understand what your needs and requirements are. So, why do I actually need this compliance, this KYC and AML stuff? This used to be actually a much longer part of my talk in the early days of crypto, and it's shortened now because people are getting this message. If you're working on a security, you actually need to have your compliance set up in advance of registering that security. It's going to be part of what the SEC and others look at, and so it becomes an upfront part of your planning process. Obviously, all of us have read about some of the enforcement actions that have happened as a result of companies not having appropriate policies in place. And then, there's things like opening bank accounts, investor confidence, et cetera, that all count on you having appropriate controls in place to keep yourself and your service and platform safe. So, if I'm registering a security, building out a security token, one of these hottest areas in this coming year, compliance is actually the front end of the process. When you're actually registering with the SEC and talking to them, how you're doing your AML, your KYC, and your other controls around the use and transfer of this security is one of the important steps in them improving your application. So this takes your KYC planning to even before your product planning or anything else. And both for the people that you're working with on the regulatory side, but also for many investors, compliance is actually considered a feature of the security itself. It's how you're keeping the investors and the investment safe. And something that's different with securities than with the way, say, other tokens have worked is that the security issuer is responsible for ensuring that there are appropriate controls in the secondary market as well. So that means after you've issued the security, if one of your investors is selling that security to someone else, you need to make sure that on the whole there's appropriate controls in place for that process around AML, KYC, and around other legending requirements that you have on that security. Enforcement is coming from a huge variety of agencies, and I'm really focused here on the US, although there's about 1,000 other regulators globally. And these are kind of what the folks are focused on and what they think is most important. So the SEC cares if what you have is a security, and has the management of that security been appropriate, both in terms of the vetting of initial investors, as well as the exchange of that security in the secondary market. CFTC has similar views except for in the commodities area. The Treasury Department has a pretty heavy hand, and they enforce it globally. They're concerned about traditional anti-money laundering, know your customer, and increasingly something called OFAC, which is sanctions, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. This is an area where regulators have actually not been paying a ton of attention until earlier this year. And in Q1 or Q2 of this year, I forget exactly when, for the very first time, the Treasury Department issued a list of Bitcoin addresses that they considered sanctioned that people can't transact with. And so, OFAC is definitely coming into the crypto world and starting to pay attention there. And then if you're working in the US, you also have to deal with state regulators, basically in every single state. And they cover many of the same things that those above agencies do, but from the perspective of the state requirements. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place where there's a ton of US agencies that are watching what we're doing. Global law enforcement is stepping up as well. We're seeing enforcement in countries other than the US has really started in 2018. And you need to meet these increasing and growing requirements at the same time that you're growing and scaling your business. And so you want to be able to handle these onboarding things at scale and with speed so that you can bring users online to your platform at the time that they want to transact and give you money. Oh, there's a few other things. So when you go to open your bank account, your bank actually cares about where your funds came from. So if you went out and raised, 50 or 75 or $100 million in your token sale, let's say, and you didn't do KYC and AML, you're going to go to a bank and you're going to say, I want to deposit this $100 million in the bank account so I can start to spend it. And they're going to say, where did it come from? And you're going to say, it came from the internet. And they're going to say, yeah, but who? And you're going to say, I don't actually know. And they're going to say, no, thank you, we won't take your money. And there's been a number of companies in this space that have ended up in that kind of hurdle and bind, which has been a real challenge for them. And that's based on their own AML and KYC policies that they need to meet. And increasingly, the investors in your project care about your compliance policy as well, because they see this as an example of, are you looking at your business in a way that is minimizing the risks for the business, and therefore minimizing the risks for them as an investor in your business. So what are these requirements around KYC and AML that you actually need to know? And again, go back and speak to your compliance lawyers to get the specifics for your use case. But basically, is the person presenting a real and valid ID? And are they presenting an original of that ID to you, not just like uploading a picture that they have stored on their computer? Is the person that's giving you that ID actually the owner of that ID, so that they didn't just again, download it somewhere on the internet and submit it to you, or find an ID on the street and send it in? Have you checked sanctions lists and other law enforcement watch lists? And have you done something called adverse media checks? We'll touch on those in just a minute. For corporations, there's requirements as well. You need to know their incorporation information, tax ID. You need to do a full KYC of signatories on the account, people who are actually transacting on the case of the account. And you also need to do AML, not KYC, on the ultimate underlying beneficial owners. So the people who own the company, directors in the company, et cetera, to make sure that they're not money launderers or human traffickers or things like that. And then obviously you need to do checks on the corporation itself. And then finally, if you're working in the security world, you need to do something called accredited investor validation in many cases, if you're doing a Reg D or some of the others. And this is an SEC requirement. It's basically, is this investor someone who can afford to take the risk on this private investment? And the standards around this are used to be that the user would self-certify that they were an accredited investor. That's sort of been thrown to the wayside as not good enough. And now typically that's done by a third-party expert like an accountant or a lawyer who will review that information for your customer and then provide you a letter that states that they meet accredited investor validation status. So how can you tell is an ID real and valid? So first you want to check to see if the ID is real. Does it have all the security features in place? Other things like that. Has the ID been tampered with? Has someone tried to change the name or the photo in it? Is it legible? Is it expired? And you need to make sure that someone isn't submitting a photo of a photo or a photo of a computer screen, because they don't necessarily have the original ID then. You need to make sure they're in possession of that original ID at the time that they're submitting it to you. So matching the ID to the individual, you use biometrics, typically facial match or others if they're available on the ID. In some cases, you can do things like video and sentiment analysis, tie it to the person's phone or phone number to get information that way, and use social as another factor potentially to bring things in and to tie it all together. The biggest piece is typically the biometric match between the ID and the individual. And again, when you're doing that biometric match, like the facial match, you want to make sure you're actually looking at a live person that you're doing that match against, and not just a photo that they found on the internet that they're submitting to you. This is actually covered in some US government standards that NIST has, NIST. Standard like 36 something or other around remote identity validation talks about this. Sanctions, watch lists, and negative news. So this is something where you basically are checking to make sure that your customer isn't considered a bad guy by the world out there, and you're checking a variety of sources on that. Sanctions is the most strict. This is that OFAC list. You absolutely cannot do business with anybody that is a sanctioned individual or corporation or is a resident of a sanctioned country. On the other ones, other watch lists and negative news, that information is really more about informing you of the information, and you're able to make a choice on your own about whether or not you'd still like to do business with that customer. So, like if somebody was previously involved in a Ponzi scheme, they're not necessarily going to show up on a watch list, but you still might not want them buying and potentially reselling your security because it might taint what you're doing and you may choose not to work with them. So let me talk to you really quickly about some of what we do. We actually automate this for many of our customers, for individuals and corporations. We can validate identity for people in about 60 seconds globally. From the user's perspective, they spend about 30 seconds. They take a photo of the front and back of their ID and a live through the lens of the camera selfie. And during that process, we're actually taking control of the computer hardware at the operating system level and using computer vision and machine learning in the phone itself to examine the ID and the individual to make sure that they're both real, that they haven't been tampered, that the ID hasn't been tampered with, and that there's a real person with a real head and three-dimensional face in front of the camera that's live and moving and talking and walking, rather than a still photo or a photo of a photo or other things that are easily duplicated, even videos of people that you can find online. We can support over 3,000 IDs from close to 200 countries, basically anything that's a driver's license, passport, or national ID. Although if it's one of those printed out pieces of paper national IDs, we don't support those because they're too easy to duplicate and fraud. So think of anything that's really like a plastic card with security features in it, we can cover. And we do this inside of native character sets as well as native languages. On the back end, we're doing a pixel-by-pixel analysis of the ID itself for signs of tampering and security features, reading the data off of the ID to go and do the rest of the sanction screening, negative news checks, and others, and then provide back a reliance score on the match between the face and the ID itself. Those results get completed, as I said, in less than 60 seconds and can be delivered either into a compliance dashboard that we host or delivered over API to your own systems. The back-end dashboard itself dramatically drops the review time for a compliance agent because it pulls all of the materials that they need together into one place, into one record, that highlights anything that they need to look to so that they can quickly, in 1 to 3 minutes, review any of the records that need manual review. And then, kind of things to expect as you think about your compliance policy. The most important part is to take time to plan up front. Please do not try and slam this in at the last minute, or one of two things will happen. Either you're going to have a bad customer experience because you haven't taken the time to think about the user flow and things like that, or the processes on the back end to prop things up won't be fully in place, or you'll end up creating an experience that has basically security holes in your process. No matter what you do or who you use as a partner, you're going to need to participate in the process. You, as the person that's running the platform or issuing the security or token, are legally responsible for the compliance no matter what someone else tells you. And so when you get to hard decisions, you need to be the one to make them because you'll end up being the one responsible for that decision. With our solution, we see automated pass rates depending on the company of between 60 and 90%, depending on the ID type that's in. That remaining 10 to 40% requires some level of manual review or restart, and we're beating most industry rates. So you'll see less than that with anybody else. And something that's important to think about when you're dealing with high levels of automation is driving people to mobile makes a huge difference because of the camera quality and optics drive the rest of the process. So I'm going to leave it from here because I've run out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions people have if you come by my booth.